Well, good afternoon, everybody. Keep eating your lunch, and I'm going to call our policy roundtable to order here in just a second. So I hope you all enjoy it. I'm Bob Oken, and this is a policy roundtable in association with America Salutes You. And so we have a distinguished panel that we'll hear from, but we want this to be an interactive session as well. Not only eating, but asking questions. We'll have a significant Q&A. So I thought I would just explain what America Salutes You is and why we have a policy component. And my colleague, Marie Dyack from the Entertainment Industries Council, and I will be your hosts for the next hour, hour and a half perhaps. So America Salutes You puts on a series of concerts, usually an annual one, but actually next year we're going to be doing two. And it raises both awareness as well as funds for charities that help in both mental and brain wellness, particularly for veterans and first responders. And so we change our beneficiaries each year. So, for example, the Entertainment Industries Council will be a beneficiary this year, among others. The National Association of Broadcasters Leadership Foundation, which Tim is with, is another, just as examples. And so we do the concerts, we film them live to tape, and then they become holiday specials that air on broadcast stations all over the country, and we also stream them domestically and internationally. So this year's event will be November 24th in San Diego, and we have some of the great guitarists playing. We do a... See, she didn't RSVP, and so she's still there. And so it'll be, we're not sure if it'll be a 60 or 90-minute show, but we have some of the great guitarists playing, and we announced it today. We just put a press release out. You know, everybody from Billy Gibbons with ZZ Top to Warren Haynes with Allman Brothers, and Steve Lukather with Toto, and Nancy Wilson with Heart, and others. And so you'll be able to see that, but the idea is we also have a text to donate and online donations and 100% of all those donations then go to the charities. But rather than just have a one-off concert series, we wanted to also have a policy component about the latest developments in brain and mental wellness, not only for veterans and first responders, but just more generally. And so I'm going to turn it over to Marie in just a moment, and we'll get an introduction from the panelists, and they'll have some comments, and then we'll make this interactive. And we wanted it to be a working lunch, so if you want to go up and get seconds, you're welcome. But I think the most important thing, the 2 points I want to make is, one is Happy Halloween, and number two, what a night for the Nats. So, I never thought I would see it. So we're also filming this, and it'll be slightly edited, and then this will live on the America Salutes You website, and we can make it available to anyone here that wants it. And it's in the spirit of open sourcing information. We wanted to capture it so that it lived on. We did one in LA that's also on our website, which was just terrific. But I've gotten to know a number of the panelists, and I think we'll have a great time. So with that, Marie, can I turn it to you?
Sure. Thank you. And thanks, everybody, for taking the time to come out on Halloween. Bob, when he first contacted me, said, you know, we want to have a policy component. Even though the concerts are fabulous, we want to have that other discussion about what's going on, especially in these two areas when you're talking about suicide prevention, overdose deaths, where there's overlap, where there isn't. The stories seem to be so commonplace, and at the same time, there seems to be audience fatigue when we talk about entertainment programming in particular. How many times are we going to see this? And when do we get to see stories of hope, of recovery, of treatment that's actually making a difference, and the science that supports it? So I said, sure, Bob, but in order to do this kind of panel, we need a very eclectic group of people, both on the panel and in the audience here, and a manageable size. And we wanted to be sure that there are a lot of new insight, you know, have that epiphany when you're here, that aha moment to say, I never thought of it from that perspective, and enrich the work that we do. We used to call these briefings Picture This, and that's what we're going to be asking you to do and the panelists to do. How do we picture stories of hope that are actually very realistic? How do we identify and look for resources for treatment that have some science background to them and credible science behind it? And I want to use two examples of words, because all of this is done. I'm working from a script. We all write notes. We all have, movies have scripts. Every word can make a difference. When we're talking about somebody who is addicted, to refer to them as a person with an addiction instead of an addict. That one change changes the trajectory of the rest of the narrative. And that's what we're looking for, less discriminating and more focused on healing. There's did anybody see the movie The Social Network? It's a few years ago, about Facebook. There was an interesting scene in there where Justin Timberlake and, is it Jesse, what was his name? Was it Jesse Eisenberg, who's playing the role. And Jesse Eisenberg said, so what do you think of my new idea, the Facebook? And Justin Timberlake starts to walk out of the room and then turns back and says, drop the. That one word, think about the difference that makes. That one word. And other shows have also given us vocabulary, the show Intervention. We now know what that means. Like it or not, we at least have a new part of our vocabulary that can help when we need to do something like that. So what we're going to do is I'm going to introduce our panel. Some of these people know each other and some do not. They're going to be meeting each other for the first time. They all are important pieces in Autism Speaks. I mentioned the puzzle part, and that's pretty much what we're looking at today too. Pieces of the puzzle that can enrich each of us. And then once I introduce the panelists, we're going to pass the mic around so they know who they're talking to. And this is not a commercial break. It's your name and who you represent, but we're going to pass it around so that they know, before they make their great remarks, who the audience is. So Ron Manderscheid. I contacted Ron and I said, Ron, you represent the National Association for Rural Mental Health. And rural mental health, I think, has some misnomers and what it is and what it is not. But Ron will be addressing that piece of this conversation. Sergeant First Class Daniel Ryan, representing the Center for Discovery, a veteran, deployed twice as I understand it. The Center for Discovery is a nonprofit that has worked with a number of the educational health clinic services for children and individuals within the autism spectrum. Debbie Carroll. Debbie is with Music Cares. And Music Cares, part of the Grammy Association, the organization, works with the artist, the musicians that we all love, who affect our lives. And Debbie provides services along with Music Cares based in Nashville. Dr. Keita Franklin is the Chief Clinical Officer at PsychHub. Keita has worked with us on a couple of different briefings we've done, both with Viacom and Fox Corporate in Los Angeles. She, within the veteran and also within the civilian community, has been an advocate and a strong supporter of services for suicide prevention.
And Keita was the first to lead our roundtable when we were up in New York. We also had the VA secretary come in for our second concert, which was in New York.
That's right. So that should put you all on notice. The better you do here, the more we're going to call you. So I'm just putting that out there, full disclosure. Dr. Matt Miller. Matt didn't know him and said, we need somebody in LA to talk about the Veterans Crisis Line. And you seem to be the guy. And he showed up, talked about a leap of faith, and did a terrific job in talking to the TV producers. But it's amazing how that service has grown, and we're going to get a better insight into what they do and who's actually making these calls. What are those stories about? So with that, I'm going to start here, and I get to share the mic. Okay?
I'm
And just work it around.
Sue Borschel with Morrison and Forster, a national law firm, international.
Genevieve Chase. I'm also in the Army Reserve. I won't say my rank, but I'm the founder and executive director of American Women Veterans and a suicide survivor.
Tracy Shiflett, I'm with Rheingold, and I work on work for veteran suicide prevention with the Office of Mental Health and Suicide Prevention at VA.
Wendy Laxo with the Department of Veterans Affairs Suicide Prevention Office. I'm the Director for Partnerships.
Jean Matthews, Dean of the Malek School of Health Professions at Marymount University here in Arlington.
Liz Hunger with Walgreens.
Akin Genjar, I'm a fellow at Autism Speaks.
Hi, Dave Sidkowski. I'm Director of Public Policy at Autism Speaks.
I'm Camilla Reese. I'm with the National Institute for Science on Public Policy. We're focused on environmental aspects in health and mental health, in particular now focused on tech overuse and addiction and the role in the chronic illness problems that we're seeing, including the opioid epidemic.
Hi, I'm Emery Cushing. I'm a integrative health consultant and also advocate for Voice for Hope, an organization related to the values of various different practitioners going down to Congress and letting them know exactly what is needed in the world. So it's a health advocacy organization.
I'm Toby Marquez. I'm a filmmaker, but today I work for Marie and Bob.
Hi, I'm Jim Fruin. I'm just a dad, but I represent Addiction Policy Forum, a nonprofit here in Washington, D.C. I lost my son, Scott, through the opioid epidemic we have going on and through suicide. So I'm very interested in hearing everything today, so thank you for having me.
I'm Bill Garmo. I'm a neuropsychologist and the chair of psychology for MedStar National Rehab Hospital.
Robin Minsher, Project Director with Rheingold, providing communication services for mental health, both in the DoD side and now with VA.
Hi, I'm Monica Belay, and I'm with the Writers Guild of America. I'm on the council, and I'm also on the advisory committee of Women in Film and Video.
I'm Sis Wenger, and I'm the president and CEO of the National Association for Children of Addiction. We're very interested in this subject because our kids are at very high risk for suicide.
Hi, I'm Tim Dotson, Director of Development for the National Association of Broadcasters Leadership Foundation. Happy to be here.
Thank you. So enlightening and maybe a little awesome.
Two other points. Both MedStar and Walgreens have been strong supporters of our concerts and are here in the sponsorship capacity, so thank you to both.
Thank you. So Ron, we'd like to get started with you and give us the landscape, what we think we know and what we actually don't know.
Thank you again for inviting me. I think it's very fascinating that you are bringing together art and the professions here. That's in a certain sense prophetic, because art can make a huge contribution to care and recovery, just absolutely. And we're gradually learning that in various fields. We're learning that in Alzheimer's right now. I have a student at USC who's doing a project in India. And the essence of the project in India is bringing music in at an early phase of Alzheimer's to slow down the progression of Alzheimer's. Absolutely fascinating. I belong to an entity called the International Fellowship for Art and for Science. And I think that entity's about 50 years old now. It was the first time that these were brought together when we didn't think in these terms. We thought more in silos. So very great. So let me say a few words about rural and bring this up to date here. So I represent the National Association for Rural Mental Health, and I also represent the National Association for County Behavioral Health and Developmental Disability Directors. So I have two associations, and the two relate fairly well because a lot of my members who are part of the National Association for Rural Mental Health are also county directors in rural counties. And we have developed, I would say, a very serious problem in rural behavioral health because we don't have any capacity out there. So if you actually look into this and say, well, of the 3,069 counties in the U.S., what proportion have no behavioral health services or inadequate behavioral health services? It's 85% of the counties. It's an astonishing number. What proportion do not have a psychiatrist? 65% of the counties. So if you start with that, and then you add to that the fast-changing structure of rural communities. So I came from a rural area myself, and when I was growing up, my perception of the community was it was a vibrant community. There were a lot of families with children that were my age. If I go back and look at that community now, it's changed dramatically. It's mainly people who are elderly. The infrastructure in those communities is decreasing. Those communities have a lot of problems with drugs, opioids, methamphetamines, et cetera. They have a lot of problems with social isolation and so on. And so we've come to talk about what are called the diseases of despair. And I'm sure you've heard that term. Diseases of despair being, what is your rate of suicide in your community or county? What is your rate of opioid overdose and death? And what is your rate of death due to cirrhosis of the liver? And if you put those three together and look at your own community, you get a sense of how well your community's doing with this change that I'm talking about. So the erosion of the infrastructure, the aging of the population, increasing social isolation, and so on. But all is not bad there, because we are now developing ways of addressing some of those issues. And Marie and I talked about this a little bit. One of the things we're doing is we're actually extending our capacity of social media for care into these rural areas. And as we do that, we're learning that social media has a huge role to play in creating chat groups between people. Huge part of social isolation is not having anybody to sit and have coffee with or talk to or go and have a glass of wine or a bottle of beer with. And so the issue is, how can you recreate that using technology in a way that is functional for these rural areas and for these rural populations? So we've made a lot of progress on that. We're now working on making progress on implementing care using technology. And so if you look at the fact that 65% of the counties don't have a psychiatrist, so if someone needs to see a psychiatrist, what do? Your only alternative is to use technology where you can literally see a psychiatrist at a distance. I teach for the University of Southern California. I teach virtually every Tuesday night. I have 15 students, doctoral students I work with. They are all virtual, and they're all over the U.S. And I would say, well, that isn't perfect, isn't 100% of what it would be if they were in the room with me, but it's 80% as good. It's much better than them not having the opportunity to go to graduate school and participate. So we have some things to overcome with our technology, but our technology is also doing good things for us. So another facet of this that I think is very important to say and repeat is, until a fairly recent period, we didn't have the concept of recovery. We couldn't go to someone and say, we actually believe that you can recover from this illness, you can recover from your drug abuse, you can recover from a mental illness, and so on. That's fairly recent. When I first came to the National Institute of Mental Health 40 years ago, we actually believed once you were a client with us, you're going to be with us forever. We don't believe that anymore. That's an amazing change. We need to bring that kind of a change out into our rural communities so that people out there have the same opportunity to have that belief as people in our urban areas. So I think a lot of this that is very exciting and so on, and I don't want to just monopolize all the time, so I'm going to stop and go on to my colleague here, and glad to answer any comments or questions at a subsequent point.
Absolutely. So the Center for Discovery, I'm the Strategic Projects Manager at the Center for Discovery, which is a nationally recognized center of excellence in the Catskill region of New York State. Our organization offers residential, medical, and special education programs for children and adults with a variety of complex conditions. This includes things like significant medical conditions, developmental disabilities, and so forth. Our program combines an interdisciplinary clinical approach, so things like psychology, occupational therapy, speech therapy, et cetera, with some supplemental elements like music therapy and creative arts and biodynamic agricultural program to maximize outcomes for the folks we work with. We have a heavy focus on innovation, so we try to be at the forefront, or we are at the forefront of a lot of curriculum development and research and program implementation, and a lot of assistive technology development, some of which, again, for time, I hope to address later. Some of our recent projects that we're currently involved in have been the opening of a children's specialty hospital, which is supposed to open in the next couple of years. We're currently developing and building it out. And the focus of that program is to create a short-term assessment center for some of the folks who have complex conditions, who have difficulty in their least restrictive settings because their community supports, whether it's through their districts or their homes, just cannot effectively manage some of the more challenging maladaptive behaviors or circumstances that they're going through. So the specialty hospital by design will be a short-term assessment where we can assist in training parents, training districts, identifying deficiencies in program, identifying ways forward, and hopefully setting them out for the path for success in the least restrictive setting possible. One of the other projects that we're opening coincident with that will be the Research Center on Brain and Body Health, because we find that there's a dearth of knowledge in this area as it relates to this particular population. That there's a lot of research on brain and body health generally, but not a lot of research specific to folks with autism or some of these more complex medical conditions. So in order to, again, innovate in regards to developing appropriate interventions or developing more effective understanding which can drive policy, the Research Center would drive that understanding. Some of the other projects we've been involved in recently, so on the assistive technology side, for example, we've developed several products that are patented, including a flex table, which is a table for individuals who, there's sections of the table that can rise or lower depending on if you have somebody who has adaptive mobility. If they come up to a table, it may not be appropriate for their height, but the section of the table will actually lower so that they can properly, adequately engage in whatever's going on. Also, we're in the middle of developing a project called Indigo, and it's a mechanism by which folks who utilize manual wheelchairs would essentially be able to drive up on it, and their manual wheelchair will become a motorized wheelchair, which will increase access for them generally. Which is a project which will touch many segments of the population, not just for the folks that we work with specifically. It has direct application for veterans. It has direct application for anybody. So that's currently being tested, which has been an exciting project, and I know it's been a partnership. We received a Google grant in excess of $1 million to help take the prototype we had put forward and turn it into a marketable device, which is a pretty exciting project. So that's some of the program and research and design stuff we've been up to lately. And yeah.
I'm happy to be with everybody this afternoon, and I appreciate you've already shared a little bit about my background. I just thought I'd share some of the things that I'm most passionate about here recently. I'm working for an organization called Psych Hub, which is actually a company owned by Patrick Kennedy. And anybody who knows Patrick, he's a big advocate for mental health parity, which is basically this idea that people should get mental health care when and where they need it and for as long as they need it. And so this notion that, if you're struggling with a physical disability or any sort of physical health problem, you are able to go in and get it taken care of the best that you can, whether that's diabetes or anything else. But it's not always the case with mental health. And so folks need to be able to go in and get care for mental health or depression or any other issue, just as you would something like diabetes. So with that being said, we have a big focus on mental health literacy. So how do we teach people how to talk about mental health in such a way that they're comfortable and that they're willing to just have the right language? And I have served on a number of committees with Marie Dyack, and we've had quite a few conversations over the last few years about language in the entertainment industry, and language in families, homes, and language in communities, and how do we use the right language where people are willing to come in and get care and raise their hand and share with somebody else that it's okay if they're not okay, and that there are services available to them and friends available to them, peers, and the whole like. So at Psych Hub, Patrick's kind of taken that vision to action by producing a number of videos. So if you're interested, look at our website. You'll see some videos on like less than 2 to 4 minutes on really like what is depression, or what does it mean to have ADHD, and how can you provide care for a mom who's caring for someone with ADHD, and you know, there's hundreds of them. So that's sort of part of what I've been passionate about most recently, coming off the heels of almost 2 decades of federal service, where I worked with the military sector and lived in that sector and raised 2 kids in that sector and married a spouse and all of that good stuff. But also, the other part of what we're focused on is making sure that when people, you spoke, sir, about access to care in rural America and how hard that is, which I wholeheartedly agree, and appreciated you leading the panel with that type of a discussion, because that is critical. But also, when people do get into care, we want to make sure they get the best care possible. So another line of our work is really focused on training the providers. You know, we have a problem in our field with provider burnout. We have a problem with providers not always sure what type of care they're providing when people come into care. I have led large organizational teams where you'll go out and ask them sort of, what evidence-based practices do you use when you're treating your clients? And they'll give you all sorts of answers that you might not expect. And so our work is really focused on training providers in the best evidence-based practices, making sure they stay true to that model by supporting them in their delivery of it. So when they're providing something like cognitive behavioral therapy, we're in the rear helping them with support tools and things like that. So.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here, and listening to what everybody does around the room, that was awe-inspiring for me. So I truly believe it takes a village to do what we all do, and we're all trying to make a difference, which is terrific. Quickly, I'm Debbie Carroll. I'm Vice President of Health and Human Services for Music Cares. I oversee our programs and services nationwide. We are a charitable arm of the Recording Academy, best known for the Grammy Awards. The Recording Academy funds about 100% of our, close to 100% of our operating expenses. So everything that we raise goes to programs and services. We are a safety net for the music industry. We help artists, producers, songwriters, bus drivers, engineers, anybody who's able to document that they've been in the industry for at least 5 years. We distributed $6.5 million in aid to about 8,600 people nationwide last year. We also provide, and that's for our financial assistance programs, which can include medical bills, dental bills, basic living expenses, disaster relief, mental health services, and then we have a substance abuse component where we're able to fund individuals. We get individuals into treatment within a matter of hours, and we fund 30 days of treatment for them. We also have a variety of different programming around addiction recovery. We have sober jams, which are clean and sober jams around the country, where people can come together with like-minded individuals in a safe environment, and if they're new to recovery, they can practice their craft amongst people who get it. We also have safe harbor rooms, which are clean and sober rooms backstage at most major music award shows and festivals. We have embarked upon an effort around Narcan training. We know that Narcan is not addressing the opioid crisis, but touring is the major revenue stream for all music people at this day and time. And if each tour has access to a kit or 2 or 3, and they know how to use it, then it can possibly keep people alive long enough to get the help that they need. So we're working with booking agents, managers, all sorts of individuals in the industry, and we've recently received a grant to help with that effort. We also have aftercare groups, sober connections, which if people are out on the road and they're new to recovery, we can bring a meeting to them, to a venue, or have somebody come take them to a meeting, or just connect with them in different parts of the country. We talk a lot about connection, and you would think, well, if somebody's out on a tour, that's got to be a great way to connect with people, but it's actually a horrible way to connect with people, and it's a horrible lifestyle. Getting on a bus and with 8 to 10 other people and going from venue to venue and seeing the same thing over and over again can be very, very stressful. Also, music people, I often hear, why would a charity be needed for musicians? The top 1%, or what everybody considers, the average musician in the United States makes about $25,000 per year, and they don't have any type of resources around health insurance. They're all independent contractors.
401ks. So access to health care is very, very difficult for them. So we also provide about 300 different events around the country in major music markets that address topics of interest. We talk about family therapy for bands. We talk about financial wellness. We talk about suicide prevention. We do a lot around, we call it emotional health, because mental health, in my opinion, is a branding issue. And it has such a negative connotation with that name, and the industry has seemed to agree. And so how can we become comfortable with uncomfortable topics? We've seen a 61% increase in the need for mental health services. We were available immediately after the Las Vegas shootings, when all the guys got back to Nashville on Wednesday after the shootings occurred. I think it was Monday. We hosted a town hall meeting to talk about trauma, and we were able to connect about 150 people in the music industry with trauma therapy. So that's a thumbnail sketch of what we do.
I had just one quick question. Do we have our language right in terms of America Salutes You? We talk about brain and mental wellness. I guess that's for everybody. Does that? If not, let me know. So, okay, okay. Because there are many iterations of that, but we've had pretty good feedback, and language makes a difference. So,
makes a huge difference.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, no, you're fine. Hey, everyone. I'm Matt Miller. I am the acting director of the suicide prevention program for the VA, and previously I was the director of the Veterans Crisis Line. First and foremost, let me say that whatever you need today, I owe you, because you've already given me the best throwback lunch I think I've had in a lot of time. A perfect day for grilled cheese and tomato soup, so thank you very much for that. Second, I want to note that the individuals that do the hard work are represented here by Wendy and by Bobby in the back for suicide prevention with the VA. So thanks to them and the team that they represent. So I noticed, Bob, you have Sammy Hagar listed as I think a guest for this year. So I'm gonna go with the Sammy Hagar theme here, and I'll cite a Van Hagar song, Right Now. Remember that from about 1986? Right now, I want to give you a picture of what's happening, literally right now, both in the Veterans Crisis Line and in suicide prevention within the VA. So it is about 12:46 on a Thursday. Right now, the Veterans Crisis Line is answering about 80 to 90 phone calls this hour incoming. Those phone calls are coming in across our call centers in Canandaigua, Atlanta, and Topeka. And those responders are sitting, waiting for the phone to ring, and they work in a next up fashion across the 3 call centers. So one responder may be ready to go in Atlanta, the next call goes to them. The next responder's ready to go and in queue in Canandaigua, the next call goes to them. Across those calls, about 10 this hour, are veterans who are calling us, and they are saying that they intend to die. They are telling us that they have a plan for dying by suicide, and on many occasions this hour within those 10, they're telling us that they have a gun in their hand. I literally just received 2 minutes ago an issue brief where an 85-year-old veteran called us, said he had a gun in his hand, and hung up the phone. And we tried to call back 8 times to get a hold of this individual. We tracked him down using our resources. We called the local police officers, and the veteran died by suicide. Now, amidst that, though, the majority of the time, out of the 10 that call each hour, their lives are saved. And what happens is they agree to give life another chance. They agree to form a safety plan. They agree to talk about options for care. They walk through preventative factors that are worth being alive. And we have a conversation with our responders along those lines. These conversations aren't 8 minutes and done. These conversations are 30 minutes, 60 minutes, 2 hours, as long as it takes. And that rolls hour by hour. In addition to those 10, we have about 30 veterans in this hour right now who are calling us, and they are saying, I'm not suicidal, but I'm discouraged. I'm struggling. I don't know what to do. I feel like I'm in a rut of failing. I feel like I'm completely ineffective. I feel like I'm alone. I feel like no one understands. And our responders talk them through the situation. 30 people this hour are going to have that conversation with one of our 600 responders. The next group, we have about 10 loved ones calling us and saying, I love my veteran. What do I do? I'm concerned. Or they want to talk about resources that are available to them. So we'll direct them to Be Connected to Care. We'll direct them to other resources such as Make the Connection, to bridge services for them and resources for them. I'd be remiss if I didn't say another side of this in this hour. We'll have 5 calls that'll be what we call callers with complex needs. They call frequently. Usually there's some underlying mental health issues, and we work really hard to connect them locally to follow up resources. We'll also have about 5 calls this hour that are either prank, abusive, or have an underlying sexual pathology. And our responders will bravely, caringly talk to each one of those individuals to get to the right outcome for that individual. Finally, a surprising thing is the remainder of the calls are often individuals who have nothing to do with veteran. They know that when they call the Veterans Crisis Line, we answer, usually within 8 seconds or less. And if they call another number, the answer rate is not nearly as positive. And that's not for lack of trying. It's oftentimes a resource issue. It's oftentimes a capacity issue. But they know we'll answer. They know we won't hang up if they say no to the question, are you a veteran? So that's this hour. And this is a Thursday. Take that number on a Monday and make it about 120 per hour. We get about 65,000 calls per month. We get about 700,000 calls per year. That doesn't include chat and text services that we also receive on a daily basis. This is all in the context of what's happening right now in veteran suicide. 6,139 veterans died by suicide according to our latest data. Of the 6,139, that equates to about 16.8 veterans per day that die by suicide. This is in the context, though, of a national issue, which is why I love and so appreciate what you're doing here. What we know is 6,139 died amidst 45,000 plus individuals that died in our nation of suicide in 2017. It's become the 10th leading cause of death, but I think more troubling than saying 10th leading cause of death is if you look at the line graph for the top 10, it's the one that's not going down. It's the one that's going up. If you look at 2005 to 2017, there's about a 43% increase in our nation as a whole. If you look at 1999 through 2017, you're looking at about a 33% increase in our nation as a whole. It's become the second leading cause of death for individuals age 10 to 22, third, 22 to 34. We have a serious issue here. We have an issue with veterans and suicide, but we have an issue with America and suicide. We have an issue internationally with suicide. I think forums like this are really, really important for us to engage and perpetuate a national discussion on the topic of suicide. Within the national discussion, how beneficial will it be for individuals in this room to engage others and each other in a discussion regarding access to quality mental health services, services such as substance use disorders and opioid use disorders and depression and bipolar. But it goes beyond that, in my opinion. It also goes into broader issues. Tricky, challenging conversations such as lethal means. 70% of veteran suicides are secondary to a firearm. What can we do in terms of lethal means safety? What can we do together in terms of lethal means safety? Finally, taking a look at key social determinants, such as broadly access to health care, broadly economic disparities and equality, and things that we can do to address these things. Broadly, the language that we use and the ways that we can either promote or decrease stigma associated with suicide, associated with mental health, associated with wellness. These are the types of things that we need to tackle head on. These are the types of things that this forum is just the perfect use of time right now. So thank you for being here, and happy to answer any questions with this.
Well, that's fabulous panel. May we have a round of applause for the panelists. I'm gonna turn it over to Marie in just a moment, maybe ask a couple of questions here, and then obviously we want you to be part of it. But just in terms of the nexus of what we're trying to do with these concerts, but also raising funds for the charities and actually being very serious about the brain and mental wellness. I guess it was in New York, 2017, Secretary Shulkin was up there with an executive from Johnson & Johnson, and Tom Hanks had just done a public service announcement about veteran suicide. So we unveiled that there, and then we integrated that into the 1-hour holiday special that ran in 300 stations around the country. So that's one of the things we're trying to do. And we're talking about what Logic had done, let's say, at the Grammys, and they put up that suicide hotline number there. Is that kind of thing is what we're going to continue to try to do with these concerts, both domestically and internationally. So, Marie, you were going to ask a couple of questions of our panelists.
I am. One of the things that I find interesting, and Matt, when you bring up the data are very compelling. And I think in a forum like this, it's absolutely critical for us to frame the conversation. I get concerned when we use those kinds of numbers in more public outreach. Are we normalizing? Is that just what people do when they get to the end and we don't see any signs of hope? You know, where are those protective factors? How do we move away from some of that?
So what you're saying, Marie, is that the numbers could maybe desensitize us a little bit to the urgency and to the issue. I think that's something to be aware of. One thing for me is, particularly with veterans, with the numbers, I always start with the actual count, and I never jump to the rate. And the statisticians and epidemiologists in the room usually get a little upset at me for that, and rightfully so. But to me, 6,139 represents 6,139 souls and individual stories. And I think it's always very important, at least for me, to, in whatever venue I'm in, to not get so wrapped in the presentation of the epidemiologically sound statistics and lose the heart of where these numbers come from. I think also it's important to illustrate, though, that the numbers and the numbers I gave, they exist kind of like an iceberg. 6,139 is the tip of the iceberg. But if you look below the waterline, you'll see much higher numbers with regard to the number of individuals who have attempted in that same time frame, the number of individuals who have thought about it or struggled with it within that time frame. I think the good thing about knowing all of these numbers is continually activating us regarding the sense of urgency pertaining to this issue and helping us to understand that we all have a role to play with suicide prevention. So what are we going to do about it? If 6,139 veterans are dying, what are we going to do about it? How do we talk about it in ways where we can constructively contribute to the issue versus not so much? Now, within that, something I don't think we do as well, and I think Keita's team and others are working on this, and I think Hollywood could work on this. It's the concept of stories of hope that you talked about. Sharing, I don't know about you, but it helps me to know someone else has been there and they came out on the other end. That is extremely powerful. And the more that we can share those stories beyond the numbers and within the numbers, I think is really, really important. Music can powerfully do it. I can't tell you how many people I've heard tell me that Shinedown song, Get Up, where it's saying, get up, get moving, one day at a time. They've said, that was my story of hope. That reached me. So music is very powerful with this as well.
Ron, can you address protective factors and risk factors? Because in talking about stories of hope, and especially for some of the filmmakers that are here, what that can look like, how can we picture that?
So in many of these things we've been talking about here, including suicide, it isn't just a person acting in isolation. That person exists in a social context. The social context would include, for a veteran, likely that veteran's family, the community in which that veteran lives, other veterans in the broader area, and so on. And you have to look at the role of these social environments in preventing suicide. So what do your social supports do to prevent you from thinking about suicide or wanting to commit suicide? And then what happens in your social environment that promotes suicide? And it's only in recent times that we moved our discussion upstream from we have to treat people, which we obviously have to do, to how do we engage in prevention and promotion, and how do we then move up into these social and physical determinants of health and promote protective factors and reduce risk factors. So I think that's a huge agenda. And let me just use a couple of theoretical examples of veterans. So I have worked on veteran issues for a very long time in my current capacity, and actually worked with the Pentagon and others. And for people who have gone to Iraq or Afghanistan, one of the issues when people come back from there has been their family doesn't really understand some of the experiences they have had while they are there and doesn't really know how to support them. So it's probably not adequate simply to work with veterans after they develop PTSD, and when they come home and have symptoms of PTSD, you also have to work with that person's family so they understand what to expect when that person comes. A little more broadly in the community, many veterans, when they return from Iraq or Afghanistan, do not have jobs. When we worked on the Affordable Care Act, we estimated that 700,000 veterans would need to go onto the Medicaid expansion because they didn't have health insurance. Huge, huge issue here, basically. Part of the reason that occurs, I think, in communities is that many of the supervisors in all kinds of operations, private sector businesses, county businesses, city businesses, and so on, most of those supervisors have not themselves ever been in the military these days. So they don't have a clue about the experience someone who's been in the military has and so on. So I think there are things we can do directly today to reach out to these business people, to reach out to families, and we can begin changing that picture. So.
And Dan, I wanted to ask you a question. I know I'm pretty familiar with what the center does. My daughter is working there upon graduation and is working with the school systems up and at the Center for Discovery. But I know there's been a lot of work, again, on this veterans thematic on CBD and getting the right dosages for CBD, both for those with seizures, but also working with the 82nd Airborne and in the military community. So would you mind letting us know how that that has been progressing?
Sure. So we're currently in the midst of an observational study of addressing the use of CBD in the treatment of drug-resistant epilepsy. So we've found, and the literature supports, that there's some promising outlook as far as the use of CBD in the generally in the treatment of seizures and some of these intractable seizures, but there hasn't been any studies conducted with populations similar to the folks that we care for. So we're smack dab in the middle of about a year into this study now, where some of those individuals who have those intractable seizures have been receiving CBD, and so I can't really speak to the results because we're still in the middle of it, but if the what we're hearing from the literature about the population generally is any indication, there's definitely some progress and definitely a lot of room for increased research and knowledge in this area and with these particular populations, and that's something we're hoping to get to the heart of, because as with any type of research that drives innovative and interventions and what could be a more effective care only leads to better outcomes for the folks we work with. So it's promising, and I'm eager to see where it lands on that end. As far as the 82nd Airborne, so one of the things we've done recently is we, in partnership with the 82nd Airborne Association, have been having what we call the All-American Adventure. So the 82nd Airborne Association is not a military association. It's not part of the military. It's a civilian-led association that's comprised of former members of the 82nd. I think anybody on jump status, which is a pretty broad group of the population. So the partnership that we've engaged with the All-American Adventure has been, we were very interested in these veterans who are coming back from war zones, guys who have deployed to Afghanistan or Iraq, or what have you, upon redeployment, assisting in reintegration through engagement in activities in a natural setting. So we had reached out to them and with interest in this program, and 1 year we've held it so far. We're looking at continuing this in the future. We had 20 vets who had just returned from Kosovo and Afghanistan come to our campus, which is right in the Catskill Mountains, so there's lots of recreational opportunities. We did like hiking and fly fishing, and a lot of interaction with the individuals we work with as well, and in partnership with the local YMCA, they were out climbing peaks and doing all sorts of boating and what have you, and it was a really positive experience, and for on two accounts. One, it was a way to give back to some of the vets who are just recently returning, and guys who are in the process of reintegration. And then two, also in terms of exposure, because what we find is a lot of folks have not interacted with some of some individuals who have some very complex conditions, if management is a concern back at home or in their school districts, they're not necessarily engaging socially. But a lot of places, unfortunately, some of these folks are placed in very isolated care. So as an opportunity to get some of the folks from the 82nd who are returning, like, these are the folks we work for, and they're just like you or me, and they have their own challenges in regards to adaptive needs and whatnot, but they were out there doing all the same activities for the most part. So it was a pretty exciting time. Everyone had a
say a word about CBD.
Absolutely.
So it's very interesting that the CBD has been raised here. We're in the midst of trying to mount a major effort with the Food and Drug Administration that we get better regulations around CBD. We're in the midst of what I would call a CBD craze right now. You can go into almost any store and buy CBD products. You do not have a clue of what that product actually contains. You don't know how pure the CBD is. You don't know whether it contains THC, which is a psychoactive ingredient, or how much THC it contains, and on and on and on. So there's a huge need to move that agenda nationally so that FDA does a better regulatory job so that medical applications of CBD can come to the fore and the research we need to have done on CBD actually gets done. Huge need currently.
Marie, I'm going to turn this back over to you, but Dan, could you also just think about this whole notion of food as medicine? Because I know Dave from Autism Speaks, who I work with here in Washington, the connectivity between the brain and the gut and how important that is. And I think it also is relevant to the veterans community as well. But hold that thought, and I know Marie had a couple other questions, and we're going to ask the audience to chime in.
Well, food is always one of my favorite conversations for those of you that know me. Keita, when you're talking about this body of work that you have and the resources through Patrick Kennedy's work and so on, and of course your background, how are you getting that out to the public to let them know? I think there are so many resources, and probably around this room, that people are engaged in that, but how do we let people know they exist, and what are the couple of questions that someone should ask themselves or look online or phone to know that the resource is something they can really rely on?
So in terms of like the resources, just the first part of your question, in terms of how do we disseminate those, if people go on to the psychhub.com website, there's a link for Become a Partner, and that is all free, and all of this information is available for free. But the second part of your question is important because we're learning more about the fact that people go online to get access to healthcare information, and I was in a meeting with some of the executives at Google at one point, and they said basically that the first place people go when they have any kind of medical issue going on is Google. And so it's like used the most to sort of self-diagnose, and I'm like the first one to be guilty of it as well. Like, I have a rash, I have a bump, and it's the first place you go. And so in light of that, like, we need to make sure that what comes up is most credible. And that it is, you can get all sorts of information, you just don't know what to pay attention to and what not. So there is a bit of a movement underway trying to make sure that when people are accessing mental health, particularly healthcare writ large, information online, that it comes from a good, solid source. And so teaching people about that, I think, is critically important. And I mean, I do a lot of teaching on my own about it, and I talk to people about, sort of pay attention to the websites that you're looking at. Are they a government website that's been vetted? Is it largely, like, if you're looking for mental health resources, look at SAMHSA, look at HHS, look at some NIDA and NIAAA, these kind of federal entities, but also look at academe, so websites that end in edu. .edu usually are pushing out a lot of the latest evidence-based work. And swinging it back around to once we know it is a credible resource and people have signed up as a partner and become like a community, I recommend, like, get on listservs. The American Association of Suicidology is a great listserv. The American Foundation for Suicide Prevention is another one where they're then compiling a lot of good resources and pushing it out. And then we try to just get a lot of information disseminated from partner to partner to partner. So within the federal sector, the private, the nonprofit, and the state and government using those as dissemination arms to push information out.
Thank you.
Yes.
Debbie, so the music industry has such an influence over people's lives, and so when someone in the industry comes to you for help, are they feeling, in their request for help, in need, do they bring in their families? Are they engaging? Are they in crisis? Can you give us a sense of where they show up in your world, and what works in terms of them, and even disclosing, in a sense, to their fans, if that becomes a question or not, and the concern around that, or where their family is engaged in it?
That's a big question. But each person that contacts us has a unique need, and every person who contacts us has a story to tell. So all of our directors, all of our individuals who work with clients directly are master's trained clinicians. So we're not mandated to do that. We just do that to preserve the quality of our programs. Music industry individuals, there was a study recently conducted by Alan Kruger, who ironically took his life shortly after this study was released, and he had worked significantly with the Obama administration, and he was also a Princeton economics professor. But he and I worked together on a survey that looked at a variety of issues related to music people, and we found that, or he found that that creatives have a higher propensity for mental health issues, substance abuse issues, in general, and that the use of substances and the need for mental health services is greater amongst creatives. Many can say, why is that? And I don't know the answer to that, other than creatives have a very hard road, and tend to be very complex individuals. What we found is that also, there often families of creatives are often not very supportive of their choice, in their career choice, because it can be a life of poverty. People are following their dreams. People will say, "Oh my goodness, why on earth are you trying to be a musician or a why are you working in the music industry?" And I get it after doing this for so long. So we do the best that we can to encourage family members to get involved. I will say the music community as a whole, music people like to be associated with the music community and to feel like they are part of it. And we hear often that our services in particular give people a sense that they belong to a greater community, which is the music community. And being associated with that gives them hope that somebody cares enough to help them. In terms of disclosure, that's also a unique issue with artists in that they are their product, they are their business, and so separating that from their personal life from their professional life can be very difficult. We've also found that most people are not wired to be famous, so that in terms of the toll that it takes on individuals and their lives and who they are as an individual is very tough too. So there are occupational hazards associated with being a music person. There's a greater propensity for individuals to want to talk about their own struggles. The industry is very supportive of health and wellness, and particularly mental health issues. And so more and more people are becoming more comfortable having those conversations. Sometimes the managers, the individuals surrounding the artists can be more problematic than the artists themselves in terms of really sharing, because they feel like somehow that will hurt their career. But as noted with Logic's song and that amazing video, it had, 750 million streams on Spotify, and the crisis centers that had double the number of individuals calling for quite some time after that song was released. That shows that individuals are hungry for more information and connection around mental health issues. So if creatives have a higher propensity, why wouldn't they talk about it more? We talk often about people sharing their stories. It's a fine line for us because we also are very diligent about confidentiality, and that it's hard to reach out for help, so we don't ever ask, but if people offer, we certainly take them up on it. So we have information on our websites, and we encourage that. And I will say, I think on the Grammy show this year, there will be a segment about music ears in particular, and it will emphasize opioid addiction and mental health.
Hi, I'm Monica. I worked in the music industry for about almost 7 years at Warner Brothers, and what you did for not just the artists, because it is a very high pressure for the behind the scenes, for everyone from A&R to promotion to radio, to all of that. So I know that your organization is really helpful to the artists and the employees, because that was one of our benefits, was your organization. Do you go to each label? Are you still actively involved in going in-house? Because I think, as you said, the artists are protected from publicists, make sure that stuff doesn't get out, and I've seen a lot with it. So are you still really active with each label, and how is that affecting with people going out and not necessarily on a label, because the industry has changed so much with streaming?
We are. We have a bandwidth issue at the moment where we have grown so substantially, and our little lean team continues to dig deep and do more. So we're working currently on our messaging and our branding and how we reach our community, because I'm still in awe with how many people don't know about us. And we're particularly emphasizing the newer artists. So how can we help work more around prevention before the wheels fall off and then they're in crisis? So how can we educate artists, managers, publicists, et cetera, on how to take care of an artist? Because everybody's doing a lot to protect that person, when we see people all the time that we're like, it's either they're going to die or something really tragic is going to happen. And there's some that come to mind right now, and that the people around them just will not do what they need to do to get that person off the road. Or we'll get a manager who will call me and say, hey, so-and-so's addicted to such and such, and we have 5 days. I'm like, well, 5 days is not going to cut it. And you run the risk of having a dead artist, and is that what you're willing to risk? So there's still a lot of work to be done, but we're doing it one life at a time. So we're trying to get out there more.
I'm going to tee up a couple of questions from Matt and Keita and Marie about the work you're doing with the studios, particularly, I guess, Viacom and Fox, in terms of the scripts that are being written. I think that's important. And then Dan, we got to get back to you to get your answer. But some other questions. Sure, go right ahead.
Okay. Marie knows me. I'm like always I want to treat this sort of like a salon and see if we can't come up with some solutions. I'm a 30-year vet, so I sort of feel what's going on in the vet community. I also am very active with Trevor Project, which is the LGBTQ community, and I'm not saying that the problems are the same, but there are similar issues where there's stressors in their lives at different parts of their life. The LGBTQ community tends to be a younger segment. The vet tends to be, middle and older segment because of lack of resources. And I've had two acquaintances that I served with in a classified unit that killed themselves in a 3-year period. And then in the LGBT community in a 5-year span, 2 killed themselves. And I think that there are resources out there that we're not actually tapping. And so I wanted to raise for a few of you, just as you were talking, I was coming up with thoughts, but could universities provide resources by offering free education or forgiven debt for people that go through their mental health programs, counseling, sports, music, art, and then in exchange for this forgiveness, go work in the communities, in the rural areas, so that the 65% of the counties that have no psychiatrists, or in the large number that have no mental health, have no music, have no art, you would get resources that way. Another resource I was thinking of when you mentioned camps, there's probably thousands of camps across the United States that would provide good sites for bringing together veterans or LGBT youth or all sorts of different varieties of stress communities of life where those camps are not, they're shuttered. They're absolutely shuttered. I can't believe that there couldn't be outreach to these camps and say, we have 40 veterans that we would like to bring to your camp. We'll bring the cooks. We ask only for the most minimal logistical support. And can we bring these folks there? Is there some way to sort of tap that resource? And then something that the Trevor Project does very effectively is they argue that the students and teachers at the school are your best intelligence officers. And I think you know that from the military. They always say, look around, everyone is an intelligence person, we all can have resources. And so they write policies, procedures, and training tools for the schools, starting at the elementary school level. So you could elevate it. Maybe it's at the installations. We had family care communities that took care of the spouses and the other family members that could, so they could recognize when stress was occurring. And so I think there's this sort of three-prong approach, and I'm curious what this room thinks on how do we get those three kinds of things, you know, education, resources, which are both camps or sites, auditoriums, it doesn't matter, more than just a single music concert here or there. So that's just my
Ron,
thought.
do you want to start with that?
Start here. First with the issue of training. So I think what you say is right on. We agree completely. So a lot of the lobbying we do is lobbying on the Hill to get loan forgiveness for people who are going into the behavioral health fields so that they go and work in these places where we don't have providers. So it's exactly the model. You've just extended the model beyond us going to the Hill and asking for forgiveness in the National Health Service Corps and other entities where you could do this by loan forgiveness to a student's loan. I think that's a brilliant idea. I think we ought to pursue that. We have to quick comment on human resources and behavioral health. We have a critical problem in our human resources. 10 years ago, it was a problem. Now it's a crisis. And we've kept flat in our behavioral health providers in the United States as we've dramatically increased the number of people with insurance and so on. And the discrepancy is growing, and we have less and less capacity relative to the needs. So I think that's a brilliant comment.
Well, let me ask you though something, is it doesn't necessarily have to be loan forgiveness, which would be at the federal or state level, but it could be as simple as every university has to give so many % free tuition. I mean, I was in the military, they sent me for free to Cornell to become specialized in my field, and that was a big sum of money. So maybe instead of a big sum of money for someone like me, they split it into 4 people. 4 people get free education, just like at the academies. For every year that it's free education, you have to go serve in a rural community for that number of years. Then you don't have student debt. You don't have to go to Congress, who is relatively ineffective, I would say these days, but for a long time. And so the universities who tend to be state-oriented, not at the Ivies, but you know, at the state universities, they would be able to pump people out into the rural communities, because having free education can often be as good as debt forgiveness.
Any other comments? Or,
Yeah, I can share if
go
you
ahead,
want.
Keita. Yep.
I think you're onto something about this, because we need more policy solutions like that are creative to get after the issues. And so I think those are really good ideas. And not only that, I would share that education is a protective factor also for saving lives. So we see in the suicide data that as people have increased education, that does serve as a buffer in the context of many of other life stressors as well. And so the other thing I share with you also about the camps that you make me think a protective factor for suicide risk is belongingness. And so again, it's a great idea when you're able to bring veterans or other like-minded groups together in a way that they can renew their sense of belongingness and feel like they fit in a community that would also serve ripple effects across other areas of their life. So I know also when we went around that you introduced yourself, I think, as also an attorney these days. And so I also share that, we see a lot of people at risk of suicide struggling with legal issues, and we see that they have touched the legal profession in the days and months leading up to their life in some capacity, in some cases related to deterioration of relationships, divorce, or other court, Department of Justice sort of issues. And so, I mean, know also, in addition to your good list, I add one more about attorneys and the role of the legal profession in being equipped to screen for suicide risk, not to turn them into mini clinicians, but just getting, attorneys comfortable with this stuff too. So I don't know what your thoughts are on that. I got you with the question.
Met me through a forum that was discussing homeless vets and trying to get resources to them, because a lot of times they get stressed because they don't know where medical care is, they don't know where mental health care is, they don't know how to get food, they don't even know where to get clothing, they're living underneath an overpass someplace.
Right.
And I always believe that the American Bar Association, which is, I sometimes I wonder why I'm paying dues to them, we tried to get them energized to get all the attorneys out there who have pro bono minimum requirements to step up and help. And I know that Marie's been working a lot on that. And so I'm agreeing with you 100% that attorneys play a critical role, because if someone's going through a divorce situation and they've also deployed.
Yes, trauma on top of trauma.
It's trauma on top of trauma, and so I think that there's a bunch of communities out there that should be helping. A lot of professional communities for free, accountants, lawyers, anyone like that.
Like the trade associations would be a place to get after it. It sounds like you're saying too. I'm going to take that note too.
Yeah.
Can I
Yeah.
make a comment to that?
Yeah, sure. Let me get this around, and then we'll go back to the panel.
Your comment about encouraging people to go into public service, I think, is a really good one. What I'm also reflecting on is, outside of the professional work I do, I work with a group that rebuilds housing after disasters and also in areas where there's bad housing stock. And one of the things, in going back to the whole rural aspect, one of the places where the group I work with rebuilds is in areas where they lose 50% of their teachers and other public service workers every year. And the reason so if you think about what's one of the insulating factors, are the role models and the mentoring you have, and if you're going through school and your teacher changes every single year. So what's the reason? What's part of the reasons? Well, one is many of those positions are funded through the public sector. They're teachers who work for school systems. They're mental health workers who work for departments of social services. And in many of those areas, the economic situations become so poor that they can't even make enough money to live in those areas. So if we're thinking from a policy point of view, we can't that's a good thing, but we also have to say the people who would go to those areas have to be able to actually survive and stay and have housing stock and have a place to get food and things like that. So it becomes an even larger policy issue of how do we make it economically feasible, particularly in areas that don't have the money to support the very resources that are needed, even if they can get loan forgiveness. There's so much more to having an affordable infrastructure for people to go and do that kind of work and to stay there and maybe even put down roots and have continuity, which then becomes an insulating factor against addictions and against suicide down the road.
Well, I don't want to monopolize, but carrying on experience I've had from a legal standpoint with the trafficking against women. And what we found very successful, we noted that problem. But what we did is we then went broader. We enlisted the cities, we enlisted the population. We know that problem. A lot of times people come out of college, they don't have a job. So the fact that there might be low pay in Montgomery, Alabama, or some place that's only got 300 residents, they're in the same or better situation because they don't have student debt. And so with the women trafficking, we ask people in the community, can you please volunteer? You have a rental, you have means. There's apartments that are vacant. Can you put these people into free housing? Give them free housing. If you have free housing and no debt, you might be willing to work on a good karma, contributing to society thing where you might only make $20,000. And if you have to be there for 4 to 6 years, depending on how much college you had, you have continuity. And in the military, everyone doesn't rotate at exactly the same time every 3 to 4 years. They might rotate in this kind of 2-year, 3-year, 1 year, so that there's overlap. And so I'm just wondering if there's not more that we could do to engage more people. It's not enough to have heads of associations and a few people here and there. I think that everyone has to be engaged. Everyone can pay forward something in the community, whether it's housing, it's food, it's a car. Just like the police departments put people in the community. We could put teachers in the community. We could put counselors and psychiatrists into the community. And I think that there has to be a way, and I've not really wrapped my head around the solution, but how do we get everyone in this room, everyone in a city, to sort of pony up and do something about it? Because every one of us, I have a spare room in my house. Why don't I have a counselor or a teacher that could work at the elementary school? I mean, I think every city, even rural, has these capabilities. They have holes that they could fill.
I know you had a question.
Question, kind of comment. We know that words matter. I know Marie says that a lot, and we're working very diligently with our safe messaging. But and stories of hope and recovery are obviously very important. But in the veteran population, I think it's tough for us to target those that need help because it's a fine line. We don't want the nation to think that our veterans are all broken. So I'm just a comment or your thoughts on how we go about that, targeting those that actually need help without making it look like we've got veterans, that all of our veterans are broken, because I think that's kind of the theme I'm starting to see right now in the U.S. So I'm a little concerned about that.
The one thing I've heard is that they don't want sympathy, they want an opportunity. So that's but anyway, please.
You answered your own statement with the stories. We're not telling those stories. We're not telling those stories in the veteran community, among veterans, with people that veterans look to and admire, like the Medal of Honor recipients, the POWs, and stuff like that. That goes to the documentary that I want to do. You kind of, right there.
I did, yeah, I did. Well, and I get it. I still think it's that fine line. Because even with the stories of hope, they've come from somewhere, right? Not everybody comes from that place, especially
So
maybe Dan and Matt, you want to respond, and then we get another question.
Sure.
So just a little help since I'm in partnerships comms person.
So two things come to mind. I think tangentially will relate to what you're saying, but I think more directly may relate to what you had mentioned. So trauma is kind of a dirty word, right? In a sense, like nobody likes to be associated with like the concept of trauma. I think it's prudent to recognize that that deployment is traumatic by nature. Even if you aren't experiencing acute trauma, you have been upended, right? So like psychologically, you are dealing with some kind of trauma, right? It may just be due to separation from home or an environment that's unfamiliar or whatever. Like that's a traumatic experience of a hopefully low grade but somewhat chronic, right? And then you've got folks in acute traumatic situations, and there's consequences of that. And then you've got, veterans who return home and are experiencing continued trauma because maybe they can't plug into meaningful work, or they can't plug into, an atmosphere where they can socialize. So kind of to your point, as far as like camps and socialization, I think that's a really great idea, because a lot of folks that, I can only speak from my experience, right? There's not necessarily the sense that when a vet returns home that their experience will be understood, and I don't mean necessarily the literal experience they went through. I mean just the experience of it in totality, right? That the folks they return home to, like, there's no basis of understanding, like, of that experience, right? So connecting with other veterans who have that commonality is extremely important. So whether it's fostered in like a camp or however, like anything you could do to foster that is helpful, right? But it's got to be continued. It can't just be like a one-off. Like, so the extent that you can foster that in a continuing basis, because that becomes a continuing resource that anyone can reach out and utilize, right? This is now a relationship. It's not an experience, So part of it is fostering that, and then the other part of it, I think, and the larger muscle movement here is how do you inculcate in the population at large the consequences of what happens when you send someone to war? Like, how does the population at large come to terms with that experience and what the vets on an individual basis are experiencing, and that I think we isolate ourselves from it. There's a bit of a segregation perhaps that occurs that, like, it's not necessarily well understood. Kind of related but separate, right? So the question of like meaningful work, folks in the military or folks who are deployed, again, I can only speak for myself and guys I engage with, like, we have, like, what you're doing matters like the work that I was doing on deployment felt like it was the most important work of my life. Like the colors were more vibrant, the sounds were more, like every sensory input mattered. The little actions that I took, I felt like it was impregnated with a sense of purpose that, like, when I returned home is suddenly absent. That things that you would think should have mattered didn't matter at all. It was like life had a whole, like, reality to it, right? And then folks come home and they're isolated in the sense that, like, there's a lot of like, I was very fortunate. Like, both of my deployments happened, I was at the center. I had meaningful work to return to. I returned to an organization that was replete with individuals who, you know, were trained in psychology. They were excellent listeners. I had friends who I could plug into. Not everyone is that fortunate, right? So how do you plug in veterans to having meaningful work where they feel like what they're doing matters in a similar way to what they were doing overseas, how it matters, and you know, how do you inculcate that sense of social interaction? Those are very important points.
I probably should have prefaced my comment with the fact that I'm a 30-year military spouse. My husband was active duty for 5 years. But I like your thought that everything matters. And what you do now matters. It's important.
I think that this is a, first off, Wendy doesn't need to hear more from me, so I hesitate to respond. She has to hear me every day and is probably tired of it. Just some, well done. Just a couple of comments, I guess, in response to this. First, I think that a couple of you have mentioned a point that's really important to bear in mind as we talk about suicide prevention, veterans, and the national discussion. And that is, one of the first interviews I did was on Cuomo's Prime Time. And the first question was, why suicide? Why do people die by suicide? And I think we all look for one answer. And there isn't one. There isn't one definition or embodiment of veteran. There are 19.8 million veterans, each with a unique story, and they are not characterized alone, but in part by the 6,139 that have died within the last year of count. There is not a homogeneous definition of combat and the impact of combat. There is not a homogeneous impact on deployment. We find that some individuals who have been deployed report tremendous growth and enrichment. We find that a moderating variable a lot of times is unit cohesion, not the actual deployment or combat. And there's not a homogeneity to that necessarily either. A thought that I'll leave you on. So thought number one is continue to be sensitive to the heterogeneous nature of this issue and veterans. Number two, I think as we I'm really intrigued by the emerging language of post-traumatic growth versus post-traumatic disorder. I think helping to shape and frame that possibility are very important as well, that no matter what you've been through, and as natural as it would be to experience post-traumatic disorder secondary, there's also post-traumatic growth that's possible. And what do we need to do to together pursue that?
So I've been listening to all the questions and answers, and I keep saying to myself, there's a piece for prevention here that I'm not hearing. I represent the National Association for Children of Addiction. The most recent thing that we've worked on to try and give hope to children is the release at Sesame Street. I don't know if you've noticed that. People, when you work with Sesame Street, you don't say a word to anybody for months, and then all of a sudden you're allowed to let it explode. Well, that happened a couple weeks ago, and children of veterans who have alcohol or drug problems certainly could benefit from being referred there. I'm working with PTEC, the Police Treatment and Community Organization, which is kind of a movement for not just diversion, but pre-arrest diversion that they're calling deflection. And we're working with them to create messages that they can pass on, even though they won't see the children. They may be picking up somebody, maybe stopping a teenager who's acting and who's in a troublesome group, whatever. That they're conscious that that child doesn't live alone, or that man doesn't live alone, that there is a circle of people who are profoundly impacted by the fact that he or she was stopped, not arrested or prosecuted, but stopped, has a profound impact. And so what we try to do is, and I think this can happen in almost every encounter. If you take the progression of addiction or the progression of mental illness in a family and you look at the points of progression, at every point you can see a prevention strategy, not only to help that person, but to prevent the problem from growing. And I don't see this, I mean, it's coming. The one advantage of the terrible opioid crisis is that it has made people in this country aware that those children who have been hiding all these years behind all the trauma in their family, people are wondering where they are and wondering if maybe we ought to do something. They aren't funding it yet, but I think in everything you've been talking about, if you added that extra question and then brought in people who are experts in the age-appropriate behavior of the children involved, we're just rolling out a children's program kit, which can be used in multiple environments with lots of things that are fun, and it's probably will be used more in schools than anywhere, where children learn what addiction is. They learn in really simple, age-appropriate language. They learn what it is. They learn that it's a brain disease, which separates the person they love from the disease that they hate, and allows them to make that separation so they can go through the kind of growth we're wanting to give. I mean, I think that language is beautiful. Post-traumatic, I've been hearing post-traumatic stress for too many years. And what we do, and what I think everyone around this table has a chance to do in the work that you are engaged in, is to think, what is it that we could add, or who else is impacted, and then ask some authorities to help you understand what that means. You don't have to have the answers, but I think you really need to know that for every one adult that you're trying to help, there's this little group of people who are suffering terribly and in many cases developing their own PTSD because of the hopelessness that they feel. You know, the veteran's not the only hopeless person here, but the veteran can have more hope if their family is getting healthier. So we'd be glad to help you.
I know we had another question there. Did any of the panelists want to respond? Otherwise, maybe we might make this the last question because we're almost at our time here, unless there's some wrap-up comments. So
I couldn't agree with you more what you just said. I mean, you know, think about what we've been talking about, you know, CBD or whatever. We know more about the brain development now than we've ever known. We know what happens to the brain. It's a story of hope. Now, look, I lost my son to this, but I want to talk about a story of hope and how we can go make a difference to those in recovery, those who need, you know, rural America. And I think we get caught up in, the numbers are important, but we now know that the brain fully develops for a male at the age of 24. For females, it's 21. People want to learn. They want to know about this. They want to know the dangers. A dental procedure got my son addicted to opioids. And I just think we need to start turning it. This is no longer, let's roll with us. It's about a story of hope and empowerment, and go out there and make a difference. And our real challenge is how this great group of people here, how do we all come together and make a difference? I bump into some of you all over the place, but we go back out in our own little silos and move again. We got to start to figure out how we team and really make a difference together through the VA, through the veterans, everything. This is our country. This is our community. We can save it through hope, not just we have this problem, we have that, through solutions. I applaud you for your educational stuff. We do the same thing. People want to learn. The kids want to learn. They want to know what's going on. So thank you.
Any other wrap-up comments from the panel? I'll put in another plug for the concert. It'll be in San Diego on November 24th, and it'll run as a special towards the end of the year, probably the end of December. But what a fantastic panel. Marie, I'll let you do the conclusion.
You know, I'm going to be so bold as to throw out a charge. And Jim, to your point, if everybody here just did one more thing or one thing differently, a different way of phrasing or talking about post-traumatic growth, something, just one, then this meeting is worthwhile. But I feel like there's more to it than that. Susan, when you were talking, you know, something, what is that slogan about a dog won't let the bone go or something? I don't know what the exact wording is, but just, and you know, when we met and how some things are not changing, but Ron, with the work there are a number of people here who are doing, if we just latched onto the one thing about what all these camps when it's off season and how they can be the forums for community, and they could also address college and the workforce that's growing and college tuition. There are enough dots here to connect that if anybody's interested in pursuing that conversation, and my thank you to each of you, I'm going to put that in the email because I think we have the ability to make something happen if we can show that the whole purpose of this design, Bob and I have been serious about this from day one, is bring people who don't normally come together because we found a lot of common ground here. But I think there are a lot of resources that have been identified that could be connected and looked at in a different way. All those camps, I mean, think about it. Kids go there during the prime season, right? So with that, and Bob, thank you for creating this opportunity and to our panel.
So a round of applause for the panelists. And thank you all for coming. And again, we'll do a little edit, and we'll make this available to everybody, and it'll also live on our site. And the next one of these roundtables will be in San Diego, right? Okay. All right, well, have a great day, the rest of the day.